If so many people are committed to diversity, why aren't we seeing more traction in this space? It seems that despite good intentions, many organizations' efforts keep falling flat. In this episode, Dr. Jonathan Ashong-Lamptey will join us to uncover why we aren't seeing the inclusion we seek and explore how evidence-based approaches can revolutionize the way we approach diversity efforts in our organizations and our communities. Hi, I'm Dr. Theresa Haskins, and welcome to Think Differently, the podcast that challenges the status quo and explores the power of neurodiversity to create a more inclusive and accessible world. Together, we will talk about everything from the value of different perspectives to the limitless potential of human beings. We'll explore how embracing differences can lead to endless possibilities and how you can maximize strengths to make a positive impact on the world. So sit back, relax, and join me as we get ready to think differently. Hello, everyone. I'm so excited to have you with us today as we talk about creating impactful paths to achieving diversity and inclusion. I know that despite a lot of good efforts, many initiatives are falling flat, and the needs of so many are going left unaddressed. And there's a question as to whether the time and investment are worth the effort. And for millions of people who are negatively impacted by inaccessible structures in both education and the workplace, we know that getting inclusion right is worth every second and every dime. So what's going wrong here? Today, we're joined by Dr. Jonathan Ashong-Lamptey, the founder of the Element of Inclusion and a leading diversity expert who works with organizations just like yours to make sustainable evidence-based change. So I want to welcome you, Jonathan. I am really so glad you're able to chat today. Excited about this conversation.
Dr. Theresa, it is my pleasure to be here. It's an honor. I know we've been trying to make this happen for a while, so we finally got it together. So thank you for having me. Thank you for taking the time.
No, thank you for being here. I'd really like to start with you just kind of giving my listeners a little bit of information about who you are and this impactful work you're doing at the Element of Inclusion.
Where should I start, Doctor? I can go far back. How far back do you want me to go?
I think we should start with the origin story. What made you who you are today?
Ooh, everyone's got an origin story. My real origin story would have to be talking about my mom and how impactful and wonderful she is and an inspiration. But I'll start a little bit further and closer to my inclusion journey as I describe it. And actually it started, really got a huge milestone was in the US. 2009, January, I was at the Obama inauguration, first inauguration. And my friend's aunt actually lived in DC, invited us over. So we were there downtown. It was 1 million people. It was a lot of people. It was very cold as well. And I came back to the UK because I live in London most of the time. And I was very inspired. I wasn't very happy in my job. And I was working as an accountant. So I'm a qualified chartered accountant. What in the US, everyone calls a CPA. And every month I get a copy of Accountancy magazine. And in this magazine, and by the way, Dr. Theresa, this is the most fascinating magazine you could ever imagine, a monthly magazine about accounting, right? And in this magazine, on this occasion, it's talking about the lack of Black accountants in the UK. And in particular, the reason I picked it up is because I had a picture of Obama. And it said, it does matter if you're Black or white. So it was a kind of a throwback to the old Michael Jackson song. So I was like, okay. So I called the big four accounting firms. I called my professional body and they thought I was a journalist. No one really had an answer for this thing. And this started me on a path where I ended up quitting my job. I wanted to find out the answers to these questions. And it led me on the path where I ended up doing a PhD at the London School of Economics, exploring what we would now call diversity and inclusion. And so what happened is I got a PhD in their problems. That's what I tell my clients. And that was all about race. And by the way, I did look and investigate and answer that question. When I finished the PhD, I've come from this commercial space. and I wanted to offer something. Now, you know this, Doc, right? When you do a PhD, you're obliged, you create a contribution to knowledge, a contribution to the literature. And so I wanted to take that idea and create a contribution to the marketplace. And this is what really started me in working with clients, sharing with the world, podcasting, writing, all of that stuff. That is really the sort of mini origin story about what got me started.
And so you found a problem, just like I did. That's why I got my doctorate as well. And then you have this problem statement and you can see solutions. And one of the things we learn in our doctoral programs, and not to make it about education here, but we're always forced that if you have an idea or you have a proof or you believe you're right or you have a strategy, prove it. Prove it with research. Prove it with somebody else's evidence. And that leads us to that term you're going to hear a lot about today, guys. Evidence. The element of inclusion, both Dr. Jonathan and then my work and my own company, we are focused on like these tangible things. It's one thing to say it'll work, but it's another thing that can prove it'll work. And so I'm going to guess, Dr. Jonathan, that's part of your purpose is, the question that I started with is why are things falling flat? And that's what we're going to explore, because I think that what's missing is that element of evidence that supports the strategy you're employing. So what would you say? You work with lots of different organizations. You started with race, just like I started with autism, and then we start moving into other domains because we're a family. And what is making, we see these organizations that are championing diversity, but they're just faltering when it comes to meaningful change. Like, what's holding them back? Why can't we get our intention to action?
I think one of the challenges, Doc, is that the way people are introduced to this conversation really matters. And I like what you said as well about the evidence, the data, like what is supporting your decisions, even the way you're thinking. So a lot of people were brought into this conversation through an emotive argument. And we call this the rhetorical problem of diversity and inclusion. And you'll like this. This is a throwback to ancient Greek tradition, right? And apparently it's Aristotle who developed the rhetorical triangle. And it is said, and tell me, and I'd like everyone who's checking this out to have a little think about this, but it is said that in order to have a compelling argument, you need three things. You need ethos, pathos, logos, right? Which is, you need the credibility of the person who's making the claim. You need some sort of logic, reason behind the claim. And then you need either values or beliefs to align with the person, with the audience. And so when I think about how people have been introduced to inclusion, diversity, equity, the rhetorical problem of this is that there's too much of the emotional appeal and not enough of the credibility of the person or of a logic, sound system, idea, reason in order to make this happen. And I think this is a huge problem. And what that means is people they're making emotive moves. They're making emotive decisions and not basing it on anything else. Is this person credible? What are they saying? Does it stack up? Does it make sense? What's the overall flow or logic behind it? Because these things are missing, I think this is often why things fall over, because the emotive part, it can only motivate you for a short period of time. And by the way, often that's done with guilt and shaming as well. And I suspect members of your audience will know this. Have you ever been called a name? Oh, you said this or didn't say this, so you're racist or you're sexist or you're privileged. And it's always pointing fingers and blaming. Now, don't get me wrong. Some of those things are real. I don't want to pretend that those things or those claims, accusations, or even observations are not real. But I think the overall mainstream diversity narratives have relied on that a little bit too much instead of actually trying to bring people along and basing it on something that's sound, logical. And it doesn't always have to be logical because some people, who gets to decide what's logical, right? I prefer the term reason. What reason? What's the reason behind this? Can you explain it to somebody else when they're not here without it being all exciting and motivating? Sometimes it's quite difficult. And I think this is a huge problem for organizations. They fall foul of the rhetorical problem of diversity and inclusion.
I like that. I like bringing in things that I hope most of you have learned in speech class. I know my boys did. And one of the things I hear you saying, and I can hear people countering us, so I'll be the counter, is like, but if we don't appeal to people's emotions, they won't feel compelled to act. Now you say, but there's a reasonable argument, but I do see this trend. I mean, the ASPCA, that's the people that convey to animals. Like, we have awareness weeks, and it's usually driving awareness of the plight or potential, but I do see a heavy lean on emotion. What do you think drives people to be like, we have to convince you it's the right thing, with like changing your sentiment more than going, let's build a business case? Because there are people that are like, diversity shouldn't be a business case. People should do it because it's the right thing, right? So there's this argument that goes back and forth.
And you know that as well. And look, what our illustrious host here is doing is asking a question that she knows the answer to, which is great. And so we're going to have some different perspectives on this, right? So the first off, I'm not saying that there shouldn't be an emotive argument to this, but also when we talk about that emotional appeal, what about your beliefs? What about your values? Because also when people are guilting and shaming and blaming, they're telling us something about their beliefs and values. Their beliefs and values allow them to guilt and shame people instead of, if they have the power to, educate, inform, and inspire them. So that's one part of it. But if we go back to the whole point of the business case for diversity, one of the three biggest problems that organizations experience on their inclusion journey is around that piece about, we call it performance. Organizations struggle to articulate the business case for diversity for their specific organization. And when we say business case, it's more about how diversity, equity, inclusion, how do these things show up? So just to be really clear, when we talk about diversity, we think of it as a management approach that recognizes that as individuals, we have differences and there is value in those differences. That's how we speak about it. When we think of inclusion, we think of that as a systematic business strategy to ensure that everyone shares the same advantages and benefits. So what we say is everyone can perform, everyone can belong, everyone can reach their potential. That's how we think about it. We always encourage people to think about how they think about it. What does it mean and how does it show up in their organization? So that's point one. Being able to do that helps you to answer the next question about, is it the right thing to do? Or what? Because when people think of business case, and remember I told you, I still am. It never leaves you. I'm an accountant. So I really understand that motivation, the whole Friedman model. Organizations exist to make profits for their shareholders. I understand that framing and that thinking. And if you work in an organization that has shareholders that is required to make profits, it's very difficult to reason with them in a way that doesn't do that and doesn't acknowledge that, because it contradicts the actual basis of the organization. So part of this question as well, Doc, is people need to ask themselves, what is the purpose of an organization? Why are we here and what are we trying to achieve? So when people say it's the right thing to do, the Friedman model, which, throwback, right? This is old school. You've heard, Wall Street, greed is good, right? Greed is good. The whole point is you're there to make money. That's why the organization exists.
That's right.
Let's say, and suppose we accept that's true, Doc, right? If we accept that's true, can you see the conflict when someone says it's the right thing to do? And by the way, that whole Friedman, and talking about economists here, Milton Friedman, the whole idea of it's there to make money, that's what it does. We don't want to break any laws, but what it's not talking about is advocacy and things like that. It's very much about, look, what are we trying to achieve and how are we making that happen? So I often think there's a conflict with the role of organizations, the meaning of diversity, inclusion in an organization, and then what the people think they are there to do. So if you can't align those things, you're going to have some of these challenges.
Absolutely. And it's an interesting thing because I think when people talk about the business case for diversity, they're still missing the point because they're still trying to reconcile making the business case about including people, not really thinking about how their talent strategy aligns to the business goals and how you can open up the diversification of talent. And so they're still looking at it from a check the box, affirmative action component of, are we including these people, rather than looking at, is our talent strategy actually opening up to get the most out of our talent that's out there? And from my perspective, the neurodiversity perspective, is how our job architecture and structures are structured actually preventing top talent from coming in, because we add on other requirements that aren't actually essential for the core component of the job. Right. And so from my perspective, when we think about entry and talent, oftentimes entry is having awesome marketing and communication skills, right? Guys, I love you, LinkedIn, but if you can teach me how to answer an interview question, you just taught me marketing communication skills. By the way, that's not the job I'm applying for. Why is that the primary factor of getting the job? So leaders, when we talk about increasing diversity, I did an exercise with my students just last night, and I had them go through the exercise where they had to try to think about how to hire different animals, right? Different types of animals. Like it's a picture of a apple orchard, and it says to get the job, climb the tree. And so like the monkey is the only one that would be qualified, and you have an elephant and a fish going, what's going on here? Many of you have probably seen that cartoon. But what I like to call out at the end was it was okay that some of them had characters that even after critical assessment, they didn't think would fit, because the truth is not every person is qualified for every job. So that's fine. But the other thing that I called out is, and you're going to seize on this, Dr. Jonathan, that there was some vernacular that diversity increases creativity and innovation on a team. What I called out to my students, and I'd love your thoughts and experience on, and especially what the research says. Of course, I'm ponying up something. Yes, I do have that research too, but I want to hear your voice today. What I called out to my students is, in that exercise, it wasn't the candidate that brought diversity into the scenario and the new workplace that we were designing. They all were being challenged to think differently about how they could include talent with different skills, maybe who needed different accommodations. I go, look at how creative you all became. Look at the innovations you just started identifying to bring onto your team. When we start thinking about diversifying talent, it's not just the diverse person that brings new ways of thinking. It also forces you to think differently too. So what are you seeing, right? Because there was a huge push of diverse people bring new ideas. Are you seeing it more of a holistic, we're all better in terms of creativity when it comes to that?
I think it depends on the specific nature of the organization, because underlying what you've just said is that there's a requirement for creativity and there's a requirement for innovation in this specific organization or this specific role. And let's be honest, the growth of the economy, service-based organizations, they are benefiting from that. And that makes absolute sense. But I think what I tell people is that it's more valuable to focus on your own business case and what that means to you. So example, you said, so people talk about innovation and diversity leads to more innovation, right? That's not in all organizations at all times, in all places. And this is what the research says, not one article, not 10 articles, not 100 articles. This is the consensus, or lack of consensus actually, from all of the research. And I say this because it's really important. People talk about things like the McKinsey report and this McKinsey, I think they're on their third or fourth report talking about, and if you read it, it's very clear. They've got a big headline talking about innovation and creativity and profitability, and it impacts EBITDA, the bottom line. But if you look in each of those reports, there is a sentence somewhere which says, they're talking about a correlation, and correlation is not the same as causation. So they don't know if all of this all this cool stuff that we've just described, they don't know if that's caused by diversity or if diversity causes that, right? So Did the innovation cause tell them, oh, we're going to get more diverse people? Or we've got diversity and that leads to the innovation? This is a really important point. And so I encourage people to try and find the answers for themselves. So remember what I said earlier, your own business case, as opposed to inheriting it from what the research says. Because what people find in practice, and this has happened, and you asked me what I've seen, organizations have increased diversity, but they didn't make their workplace inclusive. So maybe they, particularly at the entry level or just below management. So they're attracting talent that is different, is not a homogenous group, but they're not necessarily able to progress within the organization. And so all of these promises that we've described, they're not benefiting from, it's not happening. And so this is why we are called the element of inclusion. We talk about evidence-based inclusion because inclusion is a crucial part. And we frankly, and this may be unpopular, we place a greater emphasis on the inclusion part than the diversity. Also, I don't assume, and other people will say this, is that when you've got inclusion, you get diversity. I don't think that's necessarily true, and I haven't seen anything robust to suggest that. But we like the idea of inclusion because it implies that everyone can perform, everyone can belong, everyone can reach their potential. And if we believed that, let's pretend we've got a mythical organization and that organization is inclusive. We're completely convinced, we have compelling evidence to show that anyone can perform, anyone can belong, anyone can reach their potential. How much emphasis would you be concerned about diversity in that organization? You'd want to actually understand why, what it means and why. You'd start asking more pointed questions instead of just saying, we expect X. You'd start to be very specific.
Yeah.
And we're not there yet.
No.
We're not there yet. But the organizations, the departments that I know that are the closest to that, they pay more attention to the inclusion part. And then everyone seems to take for granted. People seem to be less concerned about diversity as long as they believe that it's fair.
Right.
This is not an argument for ignoring diversity. It's an argument for really understanding the context of your organization.
Right. It's really, and you make a great point, because when we start, like, organizations will push out numbers and they'll be like, we have diversified our organization. But then when you start looking at, it's that inclusion component of who's really making the decisions. What does the system look like? Is there actually this opportunity for mobility? And so this leads us to looking at leaders, right? So, right, they're the gatekeepers, they're the decision makers of who's going to get that seat at the table. What do you think is the most prevalent obstacle, right? Where, they have good intentions. They're like, yeah, we want to include different people, different ideas. We're bringing people in, but it's not happening. Like in action, they're still not really achieving inclusion, regardless of how diversified the workforce is. What's going on there?
I did my PhD at the London School of Economics. But everyone thinks I've got an economics degree and I don't. But I did study economics at school as a kid. And one of the things we were always taught is that people respond to incentives and people have a strong response to strong incentives. Did you ever hear the story? I think it's called the Cobra effect. I'm going to butcher the details of this, but apparently, and I think it was in India, right? Apparently in India, there was a cobra problem. There were too many snakes around, and they thought, look, we need help. We need members of the public to help us to solve this. So what they did was they gave an incentive, like for everyone who brings like a dead cobra, in this example, we're going to pay X, right? And so they thought that's going to result in solving the problem. Everyone's going to kill them. We're going to get rid of them. What happened is it created an incentive to have cobras. So what they found was people were catching cobras, breeding them, killing them, and then claiming the reward, right? So this is an exaggerated example of the idea of incentives create outcomes. And so bringing it back to this whole point about inclusion and what do leaders need to do? A question I would ask is, are leaders incentivized to create an inclusive environment or an inclusive workspace, an inclusive team? If you don't have incentives, my experience has been it does not happen. So what are the incentives for doing that? And how can you make those incentives stick? Now, an obvious thing that people say is, well, why don't we tie, let's say diversity, suppose you've got a diversity target in your organization. It is deemed that in this marketplace, there are, let's stick with an easy, like there's 50% women in this marketplace. And we know that our clients are 50% women, right? In this mythical organization. Maybe it may be deemed, do you know what? We should have 50% women in our organization at every level, right? Suppose we accepted that and the evidence was solid. It would be really helpful if leaders were incentivized to make that happen, maybe in their compensation plans, maybe in their reviews. So these are ways. So that's a really crude example. And you can see my economics background. You oversimplify things, you pick the things that you want to emphasize and talk about that. Yeah, I do that a lot, right? But it is helpful for you to get the point. I would argue if you wanted a behavior or an outcome, you should incentivize it on a day-to-day basis in a way that makes sense. So you avoid that whole cobra effect that we discussed, and you focus on something that's going to be sustainable and generative and not degenerative in your organization.
And because you shared the cobra effect, you were leading me right towards superficial diversity initiatives, because we walked right over there. Because if the incentive is publicity, right? We see, especially in my space with Autism at Work, no offense, great companies, but is there more propaganda and the influence you're having in that space than what you're actually actualizing in terms of bringing in and retention of those folks? I know, Dr. Jonathan, and it's something I don't talk about a lot, but we're going to say it today. I know people that have worked for every single one of those publicized companies. That's a problem if they've already worked for every one of those publicized companies, because that means it didn't stick and it's not working. And I think about our friends and diversity indexes, and folks, if you don't know, you pay to play on those diversity indexes. Hundreds and thousands of dollars. So when people brag that they're the top diversity company, they are the top diversity company of those that could afford to play the game. I'm calling you out, diversity friends, because those awards don't mean what you think they mean if you have to pay to get your name on the docket. So I do see I don't want, like you said, you don't want to give diversity a bad name, right? Because there's so much good work really happening at so many levels, at so many companies. But there is this cobra effect where people want the recognition for it because it makes you look good. It helps your market share. It makes you look like a representative of your community. But then you go inside and you may have diversification of people, but you may not fully have inclusion. And we don't even want to talk about a sense of belonging right now. Well, that'll be for a different podcast on a different day, Dr. Jonathan. But what do you see superficial diversity? Like, I can see it from a mile away, but I also know that those are people that if they could get it right, might want to, because they're obviously making an investment to make the appearance. And by the way, I don't think companies, you're doing this just for appearances, but if your efforts don't match your rhetoric, that's what it is. Like, just calling you out. And I know, Dr. Jonathan, you call people out. So here we go.
Yeah. Well, do you know what? I try and call out practices over people.
Yes.
Right? And this is what I find. Everything you've said makes complete sense to me. And there's two bits. One, we call this the performative problem of diversity and inclusion. It's this focus on short-term optics. This is where, and you started to say unpopular things that I say a lot as well. So pay to play, panel events. Everyone thinks I hate panel events. I don't hate them, but it's when you've got people who don't know what they're talking about on a panel, acting as if they're leaders, and then there's no result, there's no goal. It's just this performance, a pantomime. That's not useful. It's a waste of people's time. The whole flags, food, and fun as well. I don't know how many people are familiar with this term. I didn't create it. I first heard it from Fernando Serpa years ago. And he's Flags, Food and Fun. So like, Cinco de Mayo, or it's Black History Month. And so we're going to focus on the food. We're going to have parties. And by the way, a lot of these things, they often place the groups, whether it's so-called minorities or historically marginalized communities, they often place them in an environment that is outside of the workplace. Mm-hmm. So we're a business, we're an organization, and we're going to take pictures of people who are underrepresented in that business, and we're going to show them doing anything but work. And that's a celebration, and this is supposed to be representation. So I have challenges when that is the only thing that you are doing. And yeah, the whole pay to play, let's sponsor an award, let's apply for an award, and tick box exercise. It doesn't help, and it doesn't focus on the actual challenges. So yeah, I do have challenges with that, because the people who, as you said, work in these organizations, they know the truth. And so they're painting this picture, stock images on their websites, but they're speaking to the wrong audience. They're speaking to people who aren't in the organization. The people in the organization know the truth. This becomes demotivating. It's really not helpful. So yeah, I think it's a massive problem. But why do people do it? Because it's a lot easier than doing the actual work. Like when we talk about evidence-based inclusion, specifically, we mean a decision-making process that helps you to make better decisions about inclusion. I've told you what we think inclusion is, and that works for us, works for our clients. We tell everyone to make their own mind up. Make your own mind up about what inclusion means, and then gather evidence from 4 key sources. 1 is the research. 2 is the stakeholders, the people affected by the decisions you're about to make. 3 is the organization. You hear people say, get data, get data. Most organizations are struggling to get people to share their data. And even if they do share it, what if they say, not applicable, prefer not to say? That's data, but how useful is that? Not very. Better than nothing, but not very useful. And then the last thing is professional expertise, yours and others. So that's 4 different areas where you gather evidence. And if you can't get it, then you have to create it. I want to be really clear, Doc. That's a lot of work.
It's a lot of work.
That's a lot of work. Maybe it's easier to just pay to play to get on this list, or it's easier to follow so-called common practices and pretend that they're best practices. There's a lot of that. And so I encourage you to do the hard work over time. It's iterative. It doesn't have to be overcomplicated, but it does take several steps, just like any other function in your organization. But I think people choose to go what looks like the easy route. It never is. It doesn't pay off. And also, sometimes this happens against the will of the chief diversity officers. There are chief diversity officers who really want to do the right thing, come in with a plan. This is what we're going to do. It's not going to happen next year. It's not going to happen the year after, but we're working towards this iterative goal, just like the sales team, just like everyone else. But sometimes they want things to happen really quickly. No, we need to get an award. No, we need this to happen. We need to end racism next week. It's a challenge, Doc.
It's a real challenge. One of the things I like to tell my clients is we can raise awareness and improve sentiment right away, right? That's what these initiatives and Neurodiversity Week and Women's Appreciation Month that we just had, all these things, they raise awareness. That is something you can do right now. But the real change, like realizing diversity and inclusion in your organization, that's a long game, right? So and I think that if you're going to look at your strategy, and this is really for the folks that, can't hire us, right? They have a small company of 50 or maybe, few hundred people, and they're like, I want to get it right too. Here's how you do that. Your commitment by having awareness sessions and education and what was it called? Flags, Food and Fun. That shows that you're at least aware that diversity exists. And if you haven't started there, that might be where your first step is. But if you are doing awareness things and your people maybe have employee resource groups or business resource groups, depending on what you call them, and things are happening, but you're not seeing the change, this is when you have to start thinking about the cross country, the long race. What are the incremental steps? Where are your barriers? One of the things I always like to tell with folks is your diversity needs and gaps and your story is going to look different than the company next to you. A lot of people want the toolkit and the playbook, Dr. Jonathan. I know they'll call you and be like, just tell me what I have to do. But you have to really know your problem. Some companies, I think about companies in the STEM fields, they still have a lack of women, and it isn't for a lack of trying. Like the pipeline is a problem. That's the next thing. Are you the barrier to inclusion in your company, or is it more systemic? Is it cultural? Like if women aren't becoming engineers, you're going to have a very hard time hiring them. So really thinking about, what is my organization? What is our diversity look like, right? And I'm guessing, Dr. Jonathan, these are the exact conversations you have. But leaders, these are things you can do on your own. You have some basic data. You may not have all the nuanced data. You may not know if they have a sense of belonging, but you definitely know who's being included and who's not.
Absolutely. And just the idea of focusing, as you say, we call it the three biggest problems, right? So one is that performance.
Yeah.
What is diversity and inclusion? What do these words mean? How do they show up to you? Why should anyone care? Simple language, no jargon. Can you explain it? And can other people explain it amongst themselves? You just did that alone. You'd be so far ahead of where you were, so far ahead of other organizations. The second thing which you touched on, Doc, was we call it people. Organizations struggle to include the people, or to engage the people they want to include. That's typically characterized as people who are marginalized, people who are excluded. But also, it's also part of the people who are the majority as well, the people who have privilege, have benefits, have advantages. We need everyone for inclusion. And so you need to make sure that this makes sense to the people who actually are doing well in the organization, don't see anything wrong. How do you explain to them that we're doing this initiative because of X? Kind of goes back to the first thing I said. What are these words and why do they matter in our organization? And then the second thing, well, I'm saying it the other way around, is culture. We call it potential. Create a culture of inclusion where everyone can reach their potential. This kind of points you towards some of the barriers as well. Who does get to make it? Who does get the benefit of the doubt? Who doesn't seem to be chosen? And what are the cultural norms that allow this to continue over time? Because it's like that thing of we want to focus away from individual acts of prejudice, discrimination. They're important. We do need to focus on them, right? We don't want to make that the entire solution, because the way the organization has been working, it contributes to the culture specifically. And it's often seeing things that are unseen, things that are unheard of, things that are not unheard of, unheard, not discussed, and they just continue over and over again. And this is what allows these things to, think of it as unwritten rules, norms, things that aren't questioned. When you address these three big problems, this is what we tell people, focus on those and you will make considerable progress. And I would encourage everybody to do that. And the other thing I'll add, Doug, is there's an entrepreneur called Alex Hormozy, and he was talking about a Simon Sinek book. And I don't read much Simon Sinek, right? But he wrote a book, I think it's called The Infinite Game, right? And that was taken from a history professor from NYU, Professor Cass, I believe it was. And he was talking about politics, he was talking about war, he was talking about all sorts of things. But I think it's useful to think about building inclusion as an infinite game. And he drew this contrast between a finite game, which would be whatever, making X amount of money in a particular given time, or an infinite game. Now, or think of a sport that you play, or that wherever you live, your country participates in sports, right? Those are infinite games. You know who's playing. There's a finite amount of time. You know who's playing, right? And you know the rules. Then infinite games, you've got known and unknown players. It's an infinite amount of time. It doesn't just end. The purpose of the game is to keep going. And also there are known rules, but there are no rules. You can make up your own rules. And so it's useful to think of inclusion as an infinite game, which means the purpose of the game is not to win. You don't sort of win at inclusion. We've stopped. We're inclusive now. We did it. It's something that you keep on doing. You're just there to keep on going, to stay there. And so when you think of inclusion as an infinite game, frankly, it takes a lot of the pressure off, because the question is, how do we just keep on trying? How do we keep on improving? How do we keep on going? As opposed to, how can we win that award and we're done? How can we hit that number and then we're done? It's a useful way to think about doing this work. And it means that you're not going to be subject to some of the pressures that other people are subject to. Once again, it's about what this means to you.
I love that. And I think that it's really relatable, because businesses really aren't usually to just achieve this goal. It's to sustain and grow into the future. For those that aren't familiar with business, maybe you're just a listener for other reasons, this could also, I think, about nutrition and weight loss. And that's a finite, or, when you want to lose 10 pounds, that's a finite goal, but the infinite goal is to maintain it. And so it's those incremental lifestyle changes, new practices. It's not cutting your calories for one day, but actually making lifestyle choices that sustain you and that new goal forever.
I love that. Though.
So
that's a really good way of looking at it. Like, being healthy is an infinite game.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Eating well is an infinite game. And is within the context that you have. Everyone's got a different version of this, but there's an infinite approach. As you said, it's not just one meal. It's not just one bit of exercise. It's what we're doing over time. Yeah, great. I love that.
Right. You can have that. We can use it together.
Thank you, Dr. T.
So, as I could talk to you all day, and I definitely want to bring you back and talk about some of the things that we touched on. But as we draw our time together to a close, you've given us a lot of thoughts, but is there any final words you want to share with our listeners so that they can really feel confident on their next step to actually achieving inclusion?
I would, for me, it's this evidence-based approach. Well, actually, do you know what? This is a hack, okay? This is a hack. Whatever challenge you are facing at work, someone has thought about it already in a lot more detail than you could ever imagine. So my hack would be, look at what the research says, just to get a better understanding. You don't need to become an expert, right? But even if you just read 3 research papers on a topic, and don't read all of it, right? Don't read all of it, but just get the gist of it, is going to help you to make better decisions. So I encourage people just to do that. And do you know what this does? It also protects you from people who don't know what they're talking about. It protects you from bad actors, just improving a little bit. So I always say evidence-based inclusion is about 4 things. You're important. The stakeholders are important. The organization is important. But as a hack, research. Find some research, and in particular, a meta-study. A meta-study is a study of studies. So remember when I talked about the business case for diversity? I can read one paper that's going to prove me wrong. In fact, you can find 100 papers that everything I just said is like, no, this proves that diversity equals profits. Fine. A meta-study looks at all of them, or a very large number. So if you look at a meta-study for an issue that you are having, you're going to get a much better understanding of what human knowledge says about this challenge. So I say that about the business case of diversity. The other one I say about is unconscious bias training. The body of research says it's not effective. It's not my opinion. This is what hundreds, thousands of academics, researchers, some of it not even in real life situations, some of it is in real life situations. Find out for yourself, take that shortcut. It can help you dramatically. And then you don't need to rely on so-called experts.
You can help yourself.
You can help yourself. As I always say, you can make your own mind up.
So everyone, I hope you enjoyed our conversation with Dr. Jonathan today. Doc, how can we reach you if we have further questions or want to learn more about your great work in this space?
Thank you, Doc. Well, we've got the Element of Inclusion podcast, which we claim is the longest running inclusion podcast in the world. So check it out wherever you listen to podcasts, whether you listen to them, watch them, read them, check it out. Element of Inclusion. Come to elementofinclusion.com, find us there. Also, evidence-based-inclusion.com. I've got a resource there that explains some of the 6 steps of evidence-based inclusion, why it's relevant. It picks up on some of the conversations that I've had with Dr. Theresa today as well. So some key elements there. And also LinkedIn. I write on LinkedIn every single day. So if you like sort of short ideas, inspiration, education, check that out as well. That should keep you busy. Check it out, share it with people. I'm on a mission to help 1 million people like you to make your workplace inclusive. It's participating with amazing people like Dr. Theresa that helps to make that happen. So thank you for having me. And I appreciate everyone indulging me while I share the little that I know.
Thank you, Dr. Jonathan, for being a partner on the inclusion journey with me, because friends, it's going to take all of us to make this happen. I can't thank you enough for your time, and I look forward to talking to everyone again very soon. Thank you for listening to this episode of Think Differently. I hope you found our discussion today insightful and thought-provoking. I want to thank AudioWorks Studios for their exceptional production and recording support. Without their expertise and dedication, this podcast would not be possible. If you enjoyed this episode, we encourage you to share it with others. Your support helps us to reach new audiences and promote neurodiversity in our world. Also, be sure to subscribe to this podcast on iHeartRadio, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or your favorite platform so that you can stay up to date on the latest episodes. We look forward to seeing you again soon on Think Differently.